You can start working your way back to your seat. Curious, does anybody want to share maybe a group or somebody that you feel is left out? What are some of the kind of things that came to mind that you were writing tonight? Homeless, left out from the table. Trans community. Yeah, LGBT generally, particularly in church settings sometimes. What? Mentally ill, yeah. People who struggle with addiction. So lots of different people come to mind. And I know some of you wrote others as well. And I've got to tell you a little bit about the space set up tonight. If you've been coming to the Table series for the last few weeks, you have come to expect us sitting at tables when you walk in during the series. And when Andrea and Stephen and I were planning this series, tonight we wanted to talk about people who don't have tables. Who are the people who are not welcome at tables? And so we started planning what we wanted to do tonight. We wanted to do something a little out of the box, and we said, well, what if we set up the tables, set up all the chairs just like normal, as if the tables had been there, but then we don't put tables out at all. And then we thought that would be really awkward if you're just sitting in circles staring at each other while I'm up here trying to talk. So we nixed that idea, but I want you instead to just kind of think for a minute what it feels like to not have a table. If you were just sitting by yourself in a chair and you were left out from worship tonight, how would that make you feel? As we wrap up this series, we've seen that Jesus has done some amazing things at tables. That Jesus sits down with Zacchaeus, he gets to know him, and he changes Zacchaeus' heart. He turns Zacchaeus' life around. We've seen that Jesus, after walking on the road to Emmaus, the disciples don't even recognize who Jesus is, and they sit down at a table, they share bread and wine, and all of a sudden their eyes are opened up, and at the table, they recognize Jesus for the first time. Last week we saw that Jesus turned the temple upside down by turning the tables within it upside down. Jesus has done amazing things at tables. But in every single one of these stories, and all the times when Jesus sits down with people, I imagine that Jesus has something else on his mind. Imagine that Jesus is just wondering a little bit about the people who are not there. Now, don't get me wrong, I think that Jesus is fully present with the people that he is with. And sometimes the church needs to learn that lesson. That we're not worried about the people who aren't here, but we're also focused on the people who are here, that it's a joy, it's a delight to be able to worship together. So I don't think Jesus would show up to church and walk at us, look at us and stand up front and say, where's Judy? Where's Fred? But I think he would celebrate the people who are here. But on the other side of the coin, we see that when Jesus sits down with people, he is also worried about the ones who weren't invited. Maybe not the ones who didn't show up, but the ones who weren't invited in the first place. And maybe some of the people that you wrote on your clipboards fall in that category. It reminds me a little bit of my mom at the holidays. Some of you have met my mom. And in my family, my mom is famous for inviting people to the holidays that we didn't know were going to be there. One time when I was little, I was like getting out of bed on Christmas morning, so excited to see what Santa had brought, and I wiped my eyes, just as I was getting to the bottom of the stairs, looking for all my presents, and I opened my eyes to see that there are 10 African missionaries sitting in our den that we didn't know were there. Another time, Mom was driving to the house for Thanksgiving and saw a hitchhiker on the side of the road, and she picked him up and brought him to Thanksgiving dinner. So Mom has a habit of inviting people to the holidays that we didn't know were going to be there. And at the time, we thought it was a little strange. But in thinking about this week's message, I see that as the lived out example of what Jesus is talking about in the scripture that Carla read for us just a moment ago. In this scripture, Luke chapter 14, Jesus talks about who we should invite to a meal. And he says, when you're inviting somebody to the meal, don't only invite people who can repay you. And you know what he's talking about here. If you ever go to somebody's house for dinner, you're supposed to politely on the way out the door say, oh, we'll have to have you over next time. Because what we're doing is we're reciprocating that generosity. It's good to reciprocate generosity, but Jesus is saying you can't only invite people who are doing that. You have to be able to invite people who say, I wish I could have you over, but I can't. I can't afford it, or I don't have a house, or I don't have a way to get you here. Jesus tells us we have to think about those people too. And after this little passage right here, the rest of the scripture that we heard about, Jesus tells a parable. And it goes, basically the short version is this. This host is going to have a huge banquet. And he's invited his whole neighborhood, and he's asked them to come, and they've all said, yes, I'll be there. And the day of the banquet, the host sends all the servants out and says, hey, you're still coming tonight, right? And the first guy says, oh, no, I can't make it. I bought some ox, and I've got to go see what they look like. What kind of excuse is that? Who buys ox that you haven't seen? And then the second guy has a very similar excuse. He says, I'm sorry, I would come, but I bought some land today, and I haven't seen it. I need to go see what it looks like. Can you imagine buying land or buying a house without even knowing what it looks like? And then the third excuse is maybe not quite as ridiculous, but still just as annoying, is, I'm sorry, I just got married, I can't come. And we don't know whether that means like I got married 5 minutes ago and I'm at the party, or like I got married a year ago and we're still writing thank you notes. We don't know exactly what's happening here, but we do know that this person has said, I'm going to be there, and then he doesn't show up. So the host gets angry. He gets mad, and he sends his servants. He says, fine, then go invite the poor and the blind and the crippled and the lame. And they do that, and the poor and the blind and the crippled and the lame, they show up. But then there's still seats at the table. And so the host says, fine, go, anybody who wants to come, just get them in here. We've got seats at our table. Get the people in here. Now, at first glance, if you've heard the story before, maybe if you heard it when you were a little kid, when Jesus tells parables, for me at least, I tend to think of whoever the most powerful person in that parable is, I tend to think of that person as probably God. So like in the parable of, say, the prodigal son. The father that's forgiving and loving and compassionate and welcomes people in, probably think that that's about God. In this story, at first glance, we probably think that the host is also God. That he's welcoming people in. Go get the poor, the blind, the crippled, the lame. That sounds like something Jesus would say. And in Matthew's gospel, Matthew also tells this exact same story. And in Matthew's gospel, it's not just a host. Matthew says that he's actually a king. So Matthew definitely thinks that this is God. And so if we think about the host being God, then what does that make us in the story? That probably makes us the guests, the people who are invited to the banquet. And so if we are the invited guest, and we look at all these people who don't show up because they make up excuses, we have to begin to ask ourselves, what are the ways that God is inviting me to come closer, to sit down, to have a relationship with God? What are the ways that we are making up excuses to say, I can't be there? I am too busy to pray. I'm going to be out of town for church next Sunday, and I don't want to think about it while I'm at the beach. What are the ways that we tell ourselves that we don't have time for God if we are the guests in this story? But I actually like this story a whole lot better if we think about it just a little bit differently. If we are not the guests, but if we are actually the host in this story, put yourself in those shoes for just a second. And I think there's a good reason to do this. In Luke's gospel, you remember in this story that the host gets mad, right? He invites all these people and they don't show up, and he gets mad and he goes out into the neighborhood. He's like, fine, then you come, poor person. That doesn't sound like something God would probably say. We probably don't think that God would get angry, and that's why he's inviting us out of spite. So I think Luke is inviting us to think that maybe that's not God, maybe that's us. And we need to stop and think about, who are we inviting? And therefore, who are we leaving out? So, if that's the case, I like this story a lot better, because I think what Luke is telling us, what Jesus is telling us, is that we are called not to give charity to the poor, but we are called to share our lives to make other people's lives better. We are not called to just send meals to someone's house. We are called to share a meal with someone, to welcome them into our hearts, to welcome them into our lives. I saw a beautiful example of that this week. Our friend Tom Schuyler got the idea at the church-wide Thanksgiving dinner that many of you all were at this past Wednesday for the first time. Tom suggested that maybe we should invite some people to that banquet who couldn't come otherwise. And so they went and got the van and drove it down to the room in the inn headquarters and picked up some of the men who spend the night with us on Friday night and brought them to our Thanksgiving feast. And we shared that meal together. That's what this parable is talking about. And I love what happened at that meal, because we shared not only food, but we shared our lives with each other, with these men that we didn't even know. And after, Clay had talked about the Guatemala mission trip that several of you all had been on. And he was telling us about all the kids there that need our help. And one of the homeless men at the end of the banquet came up and opened a wad of cash from his pocket and gave Clay his last $6 and said, "Will you pass this on to the kids of Guatemala?" Because when we share our lives with people, amazing things begin to happen. That would never have happened if we had just said, "Hey, here's our leftovers, let's go drop them off at the room in the inn headquarters." But because we start to share our lives with people, amazing things begin to happen. You see, God calls us towards abundance. That's why it drives me crazy, and I'm not calling anyone out, but when we go to communion and we just take the bread and we just pinch off the tiniest little drop that's going to dissolve in the grape juice before it even gets in your mouth. Because God doesn't call us just to take enough to taste it. God calls us to dive in abundantly to the life that He has called us towards. Some traditions tell this story through the feeding of the 5,000. You know, that miracle with the loaves and the fishes where there's not enough food for everybody. And of course, they're not sitting at tables, right? They're just people who are hungry. They've been waiting too long, and they've been waiting for Jesus to come. And nobody thought to bring food because they're waiting for too long. And so Jesus hears that they need something to eat, and He takes the loaves and the fishes, and what does He do with it? Multiplies it. And what we usually do is to think that Jesus did a miracle in that moment. That Jesus took the bread and the fish and just multiplied it out of thin air. But in a lot of traditions, that is actually not recorded as a miracle, but just an act of generosity. What it is, in some traditions, is a little boy who pulls out his fish and bread and asks the people around him, "Do you want some? Do you want some?" And then another little girl across the field sees what he's doing, and she opens up her box and asks the people around her, "Do you want some? Do you want some?" It wasn't a miracle. It was a feast that people were being invited into over and over and over again. And if you call that a miracle, that's a miracle we can recreate with the resources that we have here tonight. Jesus calls us towards abundance. And so I think it's fitting as we wrap up this tables series, in the midst of our abundance, to say, who is not being invited? Who's not being invited? We're going to go have Thanksgiving meals together with friends, with family, and eat leftovers for weeks and weeks until you're sick of some combination of turkey and dressing and rolls. We have abundance that we could share. But who's not being invited? I know that there are certain people sitting in this room tonight that at the time of the holidays look for people in our church who don't have friends or family in Nashville to share the Thanksgiving meal with and go and invite them to their own house. That's sharing abundance. That's a wonderful example of sharing abundance. But there's other people who are not being invited, not just people who don't have somebody to spend Thanksgiving with. I'm thinking about something I saw on the news this week. I don't know if you heard this. They were talking about the number of homeless children living in the United States. Not in some country halfway across the world, but living in the United States. You want to guess how many children are homeless? Not 1 out of 1,000,000, not 1 out of 1,000, not 1 out of 100. 1 out of 30 children living in the United States have been homeless at some point in the last year. That's 2.5 million kids, half of whom are under age 6, have been homeless in the last year. What table will they sit at for Thanksgiving? This is not abstract. This is not talking about a great feast in the next life. This is talking about where will people eat this Thanksgiving. I'm thinking about students who get bullied at school and then don't have a lunch table to sit at because they're not cool enough. I'm thinking about people who can't have Thanksgiving with their family because they work at Kmart, and on Black Friday they have to work to support their family because they lose their job if they don't. This year, Kmart is opening on Thanksgiving at 6 a.m. Not on Black Friday, on Thanksgiving. That's a lot of people who can't sit down with their families because of their job. And I think as Christians, we have to get very serious in thinking about how we do or do not support these kinds of practices. Is saving $20 on a blender worth selling our souls? Who is missing from the table? What can we do about that? We have to extend hospitality to everyone we meet in ways big and small. We have to extend hospitality to those who get rejected from everywhere else in their lives. Because if the church can't do that, who else will? We have to extend hospitality. And you'll remember that hospitality, when it is literally translated, only means love of a stranger. That's what hospitality is. Hospitality even when there's no room in the inn. Who will we invite to our table? I want to wrap up by sharing a quick story with you. Most of you are familiar with Fred Craddock, one of the great preachers in our denomination, and he tells this story about a time he went to Canada. And he was speaking at a conference there, and it was a particularly cold winter day, and there was a big blizzard that came to town. And the blizzard just came out of nowhere and covered the whole town in snow. And Fred gets trapped in his hotel because the airport's shut down, there are no cars available for rent. The hotel doesn't even have a restaurant. So he's got to go out, not expecting the snowstorm. He's just wearing a little windbreaker and a cap, and he goes out in this big blizzard to find some food. And everywhere is closed except for this one tiny little restaurant that's just covered in snow. And he goes in, and he says, "I'm sorry, sir, so many people are looking to eat today. We don't have a whole lot left. All we have is soup." And so Fred says, "I'll have the soup." And they bring the soup out, and he remembers looking at the soup, and it's just kind of one of those little, gross porridges. Probably, I don't know, I'm not going to guess. But Fred's eating the soup, and he remembers just kind of playing with it, and it's gross, and that's all there is to eat. So he shoves it down, and then while he's eating that soup, a woman walks in by herself. She clearly didn't fit in with anybody else, clearly didn't have anywhere else to go, and she sits down at the table all by herself. And the waiter asks what she wants, and she says, "I don't have any money. Is it okay if I just get a glass of water and warm up from the snow?" And the waiter starts to bring out a glass of water when the owner of the restaurant comes over, and he says, "Ma'am, this restaurant is for paying customers only. I'm sorry, I know it's cold, but you can't stay here." And so the woman starts to leave. And one by one, the people who saw what happened start to stand up, and they start to follow her out into the cold snow. until there's no one left in the restaurant. And finally, the owner stands up and he says, fine, she can stay. She can stay. Everybody just sit back down. And so she sits down, and the waiter brings her a bowl of soup, compliments of the house. And she sits there so grateful to eat the soup, and Fred's just looking around at all these people eating soup. Finally, the snow clears, and Fred goes back home. And he's telling people this story, and everybody has the same question. What kind of soup was it? And Fred said, honestly, I don't remember what it was called, but it tasted just a little bit like bread and wine. Just a little like bread and wine. Power of Christ at the communion table binds us together if we're willing to stand up for each other. Who are we going to invite to our table? Will you pray with me? Dear God, make us instruments of your peace, your goodness, your justice. For those who don't have a seat at the table this week, open our hearts and our minds. We may practice radical hospitality in whole new ways. Lord, we thank you for making a seat for each one of us at your great banquet table. May that